As you probably know, Metacritic's highest score is 99, and that score is one of the best-known titles in history, The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. Despite the 26 years since the release of the game, no doubt anyone who has a general knowledge of the history of the video game, or has experienced the game itself, will agree that Ocarina of Time is one of the most influential and important creations ever made in the history of video games, and deserves its current position. Metacritic's second place, but a very unexpected title. Metacritic's second place, with 24 reviews and 98 Metacritic points, belongs to the first edition of the relatively well-known Soul Calibur franchise. With a little bit of research, we can see that the lowest score recorded for the first edition of the fighting franchise is 88, and all 23 other reviews score 90 or higher. Let's take this bizarre case as an excuse to look at a very big concept called Metascore and the futile outcome that has led many people to mistakenly see a single score of an effect instead of following the actual reviews of independent media. Soul Calibur with Meta 98, NFL 2K1 with Meta 97, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 3 with Meta 97, and others are undoubtedly great games that many people have memories with. However, if we look back at the year of most of these titles, we find that these high scores are actually the result of the early days of centralization of the video game industry and the lack of specific criteria for reviewing the titles released at the time. Even when we compare them not with the highlights of recent years, but with the more evolved versions of the franchises, we find that later versions of many of these titles have improved in every way and have become much more quality over time. What's the problem? That a website like Metacritic, which is practically the largest platform for collecting and averaging film, game, and music scores, calls a title like Soul Calibur the best fighting game, and the second best game of all time. You might find in such a vivid example what the problem is, and as someone with relatively large knowledge of the video game industry, it's easy to see if this isn't true. But when it comes to more modern titles and less time apart, it's harder to spot the blatant misrepresentation of valuable titles. For example, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, released in 2017, was so successful that it recorded a Meta 97 score in one of the relatively busy years of video games, making it one of the top titles in 8th generation video game. However, in 2023, Nintendo released the next version of the Zelda series, which was actually an upgraded version of BOTW. Interestingly, this more complete and expanded version of the first game, with a Metascore of 96, is one step below its older brother. Even more interesting is that the two games are undoubtedly in a better position than Ocarina of Time in every way, but relying on their Metascore, we'll see a completely upside-down list. In essence, the problem with the inclusion of a Metascore is the loss of the value and impact that a work has left on the video game industry during its launch, and, more importantly, after its release. For example, a title like OOT, which is one of the founders of modern action-adventure and many of today's standards of video games, is reduced to just one game with a score almost equal to a full score on Metacritic. In essence, Metacritic can never tell you how much games like OOT, Skyrim, or GTA have influenced the future of the industry and what makes them so well known. Even worse, Metacritic never, and in any way, introduces big names and influential titles in the way they deserve and for a less informed audience. For example, Bloodborne, Death Stranding, Undertale, and so on. They all have far less meta than most old sports or fighting games. Do you really need to play a game like Madden NFL 2004 with Meta 94? Now ask this question about one of the titles that have been mentioned and have less meta than this title. Metascore has no interest in demonstrating the importance of a game at the time of its release or after its release, and as a result, unlike the media-published reviews that make the audience well aware of the values created by a video game, a numerical average score alone cannot represent these effects. If you want to consider Metascore as a measure of the importance of a title, the number of classic football games you'll experience will be far greater than the titles that are known as masterpieces of video game history these days. On the other hand, if you care more about Metascore as a professional gamer than you should be, you will usually get nothing but duplicate titles because none of the websites on Metacritic are interested in underscoring. One of the most misleading metrics you can use to review a game is Metacritic's meta of games between 80 and 90. The number of titles that fall into this category is so high that they make up about 130 pages on this website, while scores over 90 only have 15 pages. In fact, the fact is that over the long years of the website's lifespan, a score range of 80 to 90 is considered a safe range for many video game critics, with most relatively well-known titles falling within those 130 pages, regardless of their actual quality. Are all these more than 3,000 titles worth your time? Absolutely not. The issue also removes the field from the scores of games. In fact, most titles that are somewhat pre-released or have the names of major publishers behind them usually have a meta rating of between 80 and 90. There are many reasons for this, from the fear that these companies won't send the code to critics to the political and social issues that sometimes severely affect the final score of an impact, and ultimately, to try to keep the public image of the big video game brands and 3-play titles that make up only 1/10 of the website's scores, 1/5 of the titles on the site. In fact, if you look at the list of titles with relatively low meta scores, with few exceptions, most of these works have a low meta rating, because their low score was not going to be met with any opposition from any group. In principle, if we consider qualitative criteria alongside technical criteria, and we link numerical scores with the factors that have been mentioned, these 130 game pages with a meta between 80 and 90 will probably be reduced to about 20 to 30 pages. In fact, one of the issues that have made reviews published by independent and local websites and YouTube channels in the field of video games more popular than big websites like IGN is full freedom of criticism and scoring. Critiques that are beside fair and unrelated fronts are by people who know their tastes close to them. The Metascore is ultimately only a privilege. The Gospel of Revelation is given to many people, and there is no explanation of what is being done. In fact, one of the major problems with Metascore is the lack of clarity in how the final score is calculated. In Metacritic, some websites have more weight and coefficient to criticize, and as a result, the value of one of these websites can be higher than the score of several smaller websites. The problem arises where these coefficients have never been explicitly stated, and if you manually calculate the meta of a few titles, you will notice that the end result is usually about 10 points different from the Metacritic Metascore. This lack of transparency does not end in coefficients alone. Some of the reviews on this website are practically incorrect, and Metacritic refuses to remove them from the list of reviews affecting the final Metascore. For example, at the time of the release of Natural Selection 2, it was revealed that one of the negative reviews of the title was written by a critic who had not experienced the game. Although the review was removed from the original website, Metacritic never agreed to remove it from its list. In addition to such critiques, consider the milder ones like IGN's famous Too Much Water review, which actually drastically reduces a game's Metascore for trivial reasons. All of these things make everyone realize that knowing the true quality of a video game is not possible through a numerical average, but even relying on such a privilege to decide on the experience of a game is a huge mistake in many cases. Reviews published by websites always have standards, even in the worst-case scenario, and with a few exceptions, such as the examples we mentioned earlier, they usually provide comprehensive and technical reviews. In addition to following criticism from people you trust or media that you consider professional in this area is another major advantage of not relying on Metascores. a score that may have gained a lot of false significance during the last few generations, and with the media proliferation of video game brands, and even some publishers of video game are rewarded for reaching a certain point for their employees or try to score higher in various ways. And all of this and the news surrounding this website and its margins comes at a time when it has been proven that selling a game has nothing to do with its metascore. In fact, a metascore is more than a qualitative or strategic operational factor in the marketing of entertainment titles, is nothing more than a source of news margins and discussions among different groups that have little or no ability to provide a personal review of their favorite work. This is also seen more strongly among Metacritic user ratings. Most of the scores recorded in this section are reduced to 2 points, 10 and 0, and there is almost no middle ground, except in a few comments that are short and fair critiques of the work. Metacritic hasn't even tried to limit the opinions of people who come to this site just to destroy or blindly advocate it, and the best way for website owners to deal with such people has been to collectively delete negative comments. With a general conclusion, it can be concluded that even Metacritic itself understands its very low credibility in telling the truth. The credibility that is eroding with the rise of the website's image and media prominence, and it must be admitted that not only for the reasons mentioned earlier, but also because of a much larger set of challenges and problems facing websites and computer systems like this, Metacritic and any similar site are only available to make a list of published reviews for various works, and they are just useful to use.